Welcome to our Wednesday Bible study, January 24th of 2024. Glad you're tuning in. Let me invite you to our in-person Wednesday Bible study. Every Wednesday night, you're always welcome to come and be with us as we study together, as we sing together, as we pray together for that period of Bible study. We'd love to have you come and be with us. We're currently in the book of Matthew right now. In fact, tonight we'll begin Matthew 26, so we won't be too much longer in the book of Matthew, but until we're complete, that's where we're at, and then we'll enter into another study. You're always welcome to come and be with us. Then on Sunday, on the Lord's Day, we meet at 10 a.m. for a period of Bible study. We're currently in the book of Amos as we're studying through the minor prophets, those writing prophets that had shorter books or shorter messages in their writing. And we have studied the book of Joel, we've studied the book of Hosea, and now we're in the book of Amos as we're taking them as they fall in the order the listed order in the Bible, the way they're organized right now. I know Amos actually prophesied probably before Hosea, maybe somewhat contemporary, but we're studying through those minor prophets. We'd love to have you come and be with us as we learn what those prophets had to say to the children of God, to Israel, but now the application that is still there for you and I to learn from. And so we'd love to have you come and be with us for that Bible study. Also at 11 a.m., we assemble for a period of worship. We want to worship our God in spirit and in truth. And so at 11 a.m., we assemble for that. And we engage in all of the acts of worship as they are outlined in Scripture and commanded in Scripture so that we can worship Him in spirit and in truth, as we're told to do in John 4:24. On Sunday evenings, we meet for a period of worship as well. Generally, most Sunday nights, it's at 6 p.m., but on the last Sunday of each month, which this coming Sunday is, we assemble for a dinner together after the morning worship and then convene at 2 p.m. for a period of evening worship. And we'd love to have you come and visit with us in those times of Bible study and those times of worship. Now let's get back to the book of Acts. We are in a section of the book of Acts where Paul is going to be making a defense of himself and the preaching of the gospel. And so as we open up to Acts, the 23rd chapter today, and continue our study where we left off at about verse 11 last week. We're going to get into another segment of Paul's defense. Now, in the book of Acts, as we think about the run of events, the content of the book, we understand that we had the beginning point in Jerusalem, and we had that early work in those first we'll call it 10, 11 chapters, because in chapter 11 there's going to be somewhat of a turn when Paul begins working with the church at Antioch, and from there he'll enter into the mission field and go on 3 missionary journeys. So you have that initial work regarding the work of the apostles. Peter, in particular, is focused on in the work that he did as the gospel is spreading in Judea, from Jerusalem into Judea, then to Samaria, and then with the conversion of those first Gentiles in the household of Cornelius, it's going to begin to filter into the rest of the world. And Paul, that missionary apostle who is going to go forward among those Gentile nations, carries the gospel into Europe. He carries the gospel into Asia Minor and other places in those missionary fields. Well, remember in Luke's purpose, he is presenting the course of the gospel or the advancement of the kingdom as the gospel goes into all the world. He said it would begin first at Jerusalem and Judea, then unto Samaria and unto the uttermost part of the earth. And as we're beginning this portion dealing with Paul and his defenses, we're actually going to see it go all the way to Rome. When we left off last week, Jesus had just assured Paul that he needed to be of good cheer because he had done the job that he was supposed to do in Jerusalem. He had testified of Jesus there. He had testified of Jesus as he was supposed to do among the Gentiles up to that point. And now he is going to testify of him at Rome also. Now, as yet, Paul is not completely aware of how that journey to Rome is going to transpire. He knows it's going to happen. He's just seeing it unfold in these next few chapters as we're looking through it. Now, with chapter 23 and verse number 12 through chapter 24, Paul is going to be making the second of his 5 defenses as a prisoner. Now, in chapter 23, he had made a defense to the Sanhedrin. You remember he was arrested in chapter 21, and at the end of 21, he was inquiring of the chief captain if he could address the mob, the multitude that was there, and he did. Well, then on the next day, because Claudius Lysias didn't know how Paul was to be charged, he didn't know what the accusations were, he didn't understand what the conflict between he and the multitude of Jews happened to be, he is going to have a hearing, and Paul begins that hearing before the Sanhedrin Council. Well, that gets interrupted because when they're unwilling to listen to Paul, Paul mentions the resurrection. That causes the turmoil. Lysias still doesn't know what Paul is really accused of. What is it that he is supposed to be guilty of? And so that was the first defense. In chapter 23, from the point that we'll pick up with verse 12 through chapter 24, we'll see his defense before Felix. And then in chapter 25, he'll give a defense before Festus. In chapter 26, there'll be a defense, as it were, before Agrippa II. And then, as the book of Acts closes, we'll find him in Rome under house arrest for 2 years. And in that duration of time, he'll make his defense unto Caesar. And so, as we look to the Apostle Paul, the ending part of the book of Acts is basically looking at how he gets to Rome. And it's through these defenses that he makes that he will cycle himself through the channels of government to ultimately wind up before Caesar. And so that's what we're looking at. So as we break down this section, Paul before Felix, understand that in chapter 23 and verse 12 through chapter 24, we'll call it verse 23, because from verse 24 on, there's some other matters that pertain to Paul and Felix, but not the defense proper, not the court scene, if you will, where Paul makes his defense and the charges of the prosecution are made. But as we regard this matter, how does Paul get to Felix? Well, chapter 23 and verse 12 through chapter 23 and verse number 35, we're going to learn how Paul winds up in the courtroom of Felix. Then, in the first 9 verses of chapter 24, we'll see the second part of this section where the prosecution is going to make the charges known before Felix against Paul. And then, excuse me, when you pick up with verse 10 of chapter 24 through verse number 23, you'll take note of Paul's words in his defense. So we basically have 3 segments here, 3 parts in this matter pertaining to Paul in making his defense before Felix. How did he come to be before Felix? What was the circumstance that led him to the courtroom of Felix? What were the charges presented by the prosecution, and what was Paul's defense to those charges that had been levied against him? Now, a couple of things as we begin. We've mentioned Luke's purpose. We're understanding how the gospel, how the kingdom is going to advance to the uttermost part of the earth. Now, and we've already seen it in Jerusalem, we've seen it in Judea, we've seen it in Samaria, we've seen it in the provinces of the Roman Empire like Galatia, we've seen it in both northern and southern Europe with Macedonia and Achaia, even areas of Dalmatia have been mentioned, and so Asia Minor was included in the third missionary journey, the final missionary journey of Paul. And so now it's going to advance to the very seat of the empire, the ultimate in advancing the kingdom, for it to come to Rome. And of course, we know that the church was already there, but Paul is ultimately going to make it to Rome in the presentation of truth. And as we've already mentioned in our study, he's actually going to affect the house of Caesar. There will be those within the household of Caesar that are converted. And so Luke's ultimate purpose, showing the advancement of the kingdom, how it would go into all the world, unto the uttermost part of the earth. Rome being the ultimate, the seat of Roman authority, and where we're at now, this is just the road, or the beginning of the road to Rome for the Apostle Paul. It also shows God's providence, as God is with his church. In particular here, he is with Paul in the advancement of the gospel, and that gives us hope that God will be with us as we advance the gospel as well. The second thing that I think we need to introduce here is who Felix was. And we have a point for this as well that we'll make in just a minute. But as far as Felix, he's going to be introduced as this 23rd chapter comes to a close. You'll notice that in verse 24, he's going to bring him safe unto Felix. These soldiers are going to get him to Felix safely, who is the governor. He is referred to by Claudius Lysias under the most excellent governor Felix in verse number 26. So Felix, we might say, is a governor. Now, his name, full name, Felix Marcus Antonius, or Antonius. Antonius is probably how you say it, Antonius. He had been a slave to the Emperor Claudius. Now, Claudius is the same one who had the Jews expelled from Rome. That's how Paul initially met Aquila and Priscilla in Corinth in Acts chapter 18. And so this is the same emperor. Well, Felix and his brother, maybe Paulus or Paulus, were both slaves of Claudius, and Claudius set them free. And they were favorites. They were favored individuals by the emperor. And so Felix, being the more favored of the two, he's actually granted this governorship, or the procuratorship. The idea that he's the leader, he's the governor, he is in a position of authority over Judea. And he was given that authority in AD 52 or 52 AD. And he'll remain there for some 7 years. In 59 AD, he will be recalled by Nero. Nero will come to power as the emperor, and he will recall him and insert Festus. Well, Festus is one that we mentioned a moment ago, as Paul will make a defense before him, and he is the replacement of Felix. And what we'll find is Paul will be left in jail for 2 years, and while Paul's in jail, Felix gets recalled, and Festus comes in. Well, Festus is trying to deal with all of these matters, and so Paul falls into his lap, and Paul will make a defense there. But Felix will serve in this capacity of governorship for about 7 years. Now, he's described as a very bad and cruel individual. A historian, Tacitus, sometimes these names give me fits when my tongue gets a little thick and I can't say them correctly, but Tacitus was a historian who presented this particular description of Felix. He was one who served all the cruelty and lust. He exercised, or with all the cruelty and lust, he exercised the power of a king with the spirit of a slave. So he just refers to him as a very cruel and lustful individual. Now, in next week's Bible study, we'll get into a little more about his character, what we know about his character, because it will play into what Paul talks to him about in righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come. and why Felix would tremble at that. But for now, just understand, he ruled with a very cruel authority, a very lustful authority, but he was no doubt a real individual. And history speaks to that. Now, the point that I would make with that for you and I is to understand the accuracy of the Bible. The Bible is not a history book, but it does regard history. And what I mean by that is the Bible was not intended to teach us history per se. It does regard sacred history, the working of God in bringing around or bringing about the plan of salvation through His Son Jesus, but where it touches or comes in contact with secular history, it is always accurate. Whether it be Claudius Lysias, whether it be now Felix, or whether it will later be Festus or Agrippa II, Felix's wife Drusilla, wherever it touches history, it is always accurate with the annals of history. And we might even say that with geography as well. In chapter 24, it will mention how Ananias the high priest descended with the elders. Well, if you took a look at a map, you would understand that Caesarea, where Felix's palace is, was actually 70 miles north of Jerusalem. So on a map, it does show north. And generally, you and I would talk about going down or going up. You know, here I live in lower Alabama, but if I go back to where I was raised to visit my family, I would say I'm going up to Tennessee, only because the sense of north and south. Or if I'm up there, and I might say I'm going back down to Alabama. And just in the sense of thinking up and down in comparison with north and south. If we're going east and west, we might say we're going over somewhere. But in Luke's writing, when he says they descended, he's absolutely geographically correct. And the Bible is always accurate with that. And that is a testament to its inspiration. We know that the Bible comes from God, inspired of the Holy Spirit, as God used men like Luke to record these things. And so whether it be Felix or whether it be the use of the proper geography in the terminology, the Bible is always accurate. And we can have great confidence that it is the inspired Word of God. It's God's communication to us. Now, as we move on into the context and we think about Paul's defense before Felix, we need to first address the section in chapter 23. Why would Felix hear Paul? Why is it that Paul would appear before Felix? Why wasn't it handled in Jerusalem? Why didn't Claudius Lysias sort it all out, find Paul to be guiltless, and set him free? Well, remember, Lysias is somewhat in a handle. He knows that Paul now is a Roman, and he's got to be very careful how he deals with Paul, because there can be blowback on him. There can be a problem for him in his position with the Roman authorities, other Roman authorities, if he doesn't handle Paul properly. So there is a sense in which he is both protecting and trying Paul at the same time. There's no doubt been an uproar, and he might be called into question about that mob that was sparked during this feast of the Jews under his oversight or under his watch. And he needs to know how to answer. On the other side of it, Paul is a Roman citizen, so he has certain responsibilities in protecting Paul as well as a Roman citizen. So Claudius Lysias is somewhat in a handle, and he has to try to deal with sorting it all out. Well, a plot develops among the Jews in the interim. And we're told in verse number 12 that when it was day, certain of the Jews banded together, bound themselves under a curse, saying that they would neither eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. and there were more than 40 which made this conspiracy, and they came to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have bound ourselves under a great curse, that we will eat nothing until we have slain Paul." Now their plan involved deception. Their plan was, go tell Lysias that you have further questions you want to try Paul concerning. You want to examine Paul with further questioning. And of course, Lysias, needing to sort all of this out, would seemingly be willing to do that. And their plan is, we will set ourselves in a position that when he brings Paul to you, to the Sanhedrin court, we will assassinate him on his way. They're willing to do this, and they're so intent on it that they will not eat or drink. They put themselves under a great curse. They have bound themselves with this oath that they will neither eat nor drink until Paul is dead. Now, just briefly, I want to address the idea of vows and oaths and promises and such as that. In this case, there is an oath that is made that is ungodly. They have bound themselves under the penalty of a curse. What that curse actually was, I don't know. Was it just involving the fact that their death would come about in not eating and drinking if they didn't get to Paul quickly enough, if they weren't able to kill him quickly? I don't know. It seems like maybe something else beyond that, that they would have a curse pronounced upon themselves if they didn't accomplish the task, but they wouldn't eat or drink. They would get it done quickly. There wouldn't be a need to eat or drink or to bring nutrients or sustenance to their body. They would handle it quickly. And if they didn't, they would be under a curse. Now, we need to be careful about the promises we make, the oaths we take, the decisions we make regarding interaction with other people. Now, remember, in the Old Testament, there was the charge regarding oaths. It wasn't that they couldn't make a promise. It wasn't that they couldn't swear an oath, as you would put it. Notice in Numbers 30, verse 1 and 2, he says, "And Moses spake unto the heads of the tribes concerning the children of Israel, saying, This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded." And notice, this is the commandment of God. "If a man vow a vow unto the Lord, or swear an oath to bind his soul with a bond, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceedeth out of his mouth." The law of Moses demanded that if a man bound himself by an oath, it was an oath that was made before the Lord, and it was as though he had made that oath to the Lord himself, and now he's bound to keep it. In Deuteronomy 23:23, "That which is gone out of thy lips thou shalt keep and perform, even a freewill offering according as thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God, which thou hast promised with thy mouth." I think about vows that were made. According to Deuteronomy 23:23, I kind of think of what Hannah did in 1 Samuel. When Eli actually saw her talking but didn't hear what she was saying, and intervened or spoke to her. And what it was, Hannah desired to have a child, but she could not. But she did vow a vow unto the Lord that if God would bless her with a child. Remember, she was being mocked. She was being decried by her husband's other wife, as he was married to two different women, and one of them had children, the other in Hannah was barren and had no children, and it was a demeaning thing to her. And so she prayed that God would give her a child, but she also said this: if God would give her a child, she would lend him to the Lord or dedicate him to the Lord, which she did. And Samuel was reared in the temple under the leadership of Eli. And so she kept her vow. She sacrificed her son in the sense that rather than keeping him to herself in her home, she rendered him unto the Lord a servant in the temple. And Samuel, of course, served as a great priest and prophet of the people of God after Eli. So if you make a vow, you keep it, even if it's unto the Lord or unto another. In fact, in Psalm 15, it said, if you swear to your own hurt, you just keep that. If you make a promise that incurs cost on your part to fulfill, well, you bear it. You pay that cost. You don't change. You keep your word. You keep your promise. In Ecclesiastes 5, verse 4, through the first part of verse 6, he said, when thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it, for he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou hast vowed. Better is it that thou shouldest not vow than thou shouldest vow and not pay. Suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. We should never vow a vow that we don't intend to pay or that we don't intend to fulfill. And we should also not make vows that would tie us to sinful activity. These men did that. Now, someone might say, well, what about what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5 when he talked about let your yea be yea and your nay nay? Swear not at all. Now, the swearing there is to the idea of swearing an oath, taking an oath, or swearing to a vow. And you have to put yourselves in the first century when Jesus was talking and the conflict that had arisen among the Jews regarding oaths. How some oaths were seen to be important and they were strong, and others were seen to be weak and ineffective that you didn't have to keep. And thus there was a deception that was involved with it. And men were making promises and making vows and taking oaths that they never intended to keep. You might think of it in terms of being on the playground and one child makes a promise to the other and then says, oh no, my fingers were crossed, so I don't have to keep that vow. That's kind of what they were doing in Jesus' day. And Jesus said, you let your yea be yea and your nay nay. Mean what you say. He's not saying that there are no points at which you can make a vow or that you cannot swear an oath, but he's saying be truthful, be honest, do not deceive. You might say, how do you know that? Well, remember in Hebrews chapter 6, God himself swore an oath. When he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. In his interaction with Abraham received a promise from God, and it was an oath that God took that gave strength in the mind of Abraham for that promise to be fulfilled. And then he referred to two immutable things, his promise and his oath, in Hebrews 6 and verse 18, by which God cannot lie. God makes a promise, God gives an oath, he is bound, he is going to keep it because that is his holy character. Well, you and I should be the same way. What is the purpose of that vow? What is the purpose of that oath? It is for the sake of men. Our yea should be yea and our nay, nay, but sometimes for men, it is necessary to give that vow, give that oath, take that oath or swear that oath as it were, as God did with Abraham. But we should always mean what we say. We should always be true to our word, no matter what. And we should weigh those things heavily, think about them deeply before we ever let our mouth write a check that we're going to have to later cash with our actions. And that's what Ecclesiastes 5 and that first part of verse 6 that we read, suffer not thy mouth to cause thy flesh to sin. Don't let your mouth talk you into something that you will not be able to accomplish. Or don't let your mouth get you into something that you ought not be involved in. Think about those words. Weigh those words carefully. Say what you mean what you say. Follow through with what you said. Now, these men, they swore to a sin. They decided that they were going to assassinate Paul, which gives to you a fuller picture of what happened here. They are so filled with anger and rage toward the preacher of the gospel that they're ready to kill him. And so they decide that's what they'll do. Now, the plot is uncovered. We read in verse number 16 that Paul's sister's son heard of their lying in wait. He went, entered into the castle, and told Paul. So this is the only mention in all of the book of Acts of any family of Paul. We see that he had a sister, and that sister's son, which would be Paul's nephew, in some way came to know about this plot. He came to have information regarding the plot that he then took to Paul, which would indicate to you something about Paul's imprisonment here, or Paul's incarceration, that Paul was able to be visited by friends, and in this case even family. Both here and in Caesarea, he was able to be ministered unto by his family. And that kind of tells you a little bit about Paul's type of imprisonment. In the Roman system, there were three types of prisoners or prison. And one of those was like that in Acts 16, which was the common prison where the prisoner would often be shackled or put in stocks, whether hands and neck or whether feet and hands, they would be fastened in an uncomfortable position. And of course, with Paul, understanding to have been a Roman, that was not really permissible. And that posed a problem there in Philippi as well for those magistrates, as it did for Lysias to begin with when he thought to scourge him to figure out what was going on. Secondly, there is the military arrest, and this is where a prisoner is chained to a soldier. And this is as much a protection as it is an imprisonment. Paul is going to be chained. This seems to be the kind of imprisonment that he was with, because even to Agrippa in Acts 26 and verse number 29, he'll say, "Accept these chains. I wish you were altogether such as I am, except these bonds." Paul seems to be chained at that time. In fact, chapter 28 and verse 20 of Acts, he actually mentions the chain. The third type of imprisonment was free custody. That is, he's still a prisoner, but he's out on bail, if you will. That is not Paul's case here, because he is being kept by a soldier or band of soldiers, and so most likely chained to one of these soldiers. And I think in the journey to Caesarea, that is going to be understood, because there is going to be the provision of beasts for Paul and the one that he is chained to. So, as well as any gear, any kind of supplies that would also be going. So, Paul is able to be visited by this nephew. Now, I might mention in Romans chapter 16, Paul does mention some kinsmen that resided in Rome. So Paul had other family too. And where this sister lived, I don't know. Remember, they're in Jerusalem because of the Feast of Pentecost. So it could be that she lived there. It could be that she was just there because of that Jewish feast. But nonetheless, the nephew is there and hears of this plot. As the plot is uncovered, Lysias is going to deal with it. He is going to foil that plot. Now, Lysias has a self-interest. You know, he could have been rid of all this. He could have just allowed it to happen, and Paul would have been killed, and perhaps none would have been the wiser. However, when you've got a band of more than 40 men, it's going to be hard to keep that activity a secret, which would come back on Lysias. Lysias could go down there with his soldiers and arrest those 40 men, 40 plus men, and there could be a scuffle, there could be a turmoil, but he chose a different approach, both protecting Paul and himself in all of this matter. He is going to send him to Felix. He does this with 470 soldiers. The centurions are called. He says, you take 200 soldiers, you take 70 or 70 horsemen, and you take 200 spearmen. So that's a total of 470 soldiers, plus Paul and the beast that he's on, and the beast that the others would be on, and they're going to be taken by night. So they depart immediately under the cloak of darkness. They travel some 40 miles, because if you notice here, in verse number 31, the soldiers, as it was, commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Antipatris was a city about 40 miles north of Jerusalem. So they had gone over halfway to Caesarea. They're still 30 miles from Caesarea, but by night, under the cloak of darkness, this band of soldiers has escorted Paul 40 miles away from Jerusalem and safely out of the reach of his adversaries at that point, and unbeknownst to them at that. And so on the morrow, in the morning, those horsemen return, the soldiers return back, and the horsemen carry him on to Caesarea. I might just mention Antipatris was a town that was rebuilt by Herod the Great during his reign, which Herod the Great was a king over this area, over Judea or over Palestine at the time of the birth of Jesus. He's long since been dead, but he had built that town and renamed it in memory of his father. Antipater, or some would call him Antipater, but Antipater was his name, and that town was named for him. And so they bring him on from there to Felix. Now, Felix wants to know, what province is Paul from? The governor read the letter that Lysias had sent. Now, just might make mention of this. There is a little bit of a coloring of the facts here. Lysias was not in total true with everything he said to Felix. He does say, in verse 27, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Now, we know that Lysias did not know that Paul was a Roman until after he was already in custody. And it was a surprise to him when he found out. But now he presents it to Felix. I rescued him from that mob tearing him apart because I knew he was a Roman. And because he was a Roman, it was my obligation to protect him, to preserve him, and not allow that mob to tear him apart or beat him to death. And so that was not really true. We need to be truthful with our words. We need to be 100% accurate in our representation of the truth. And this man was not. As far as the jurisdiction, though, Felix wants to know what province he was from. And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, he said, I'll hear thee. Maybe it's a matter of jurisdiction. Felix would have been responsible to investigate the matter himself. If Paul is claiming to be a Roman, which the letter said he was, Lysias has already presented the fact or the information that Paul is a Roman. But Felix would have to know that for himself as well. He couldn't just take the word of another government agent. He has to protect himself as well. And so he wants to know what province. Maybe it's just about jurisdiction. He could easily prove that Paul was a Roman and thus one who needed to be heard, one who had the right to have this hearing that is going to commence. But I have another observation that I consider here as well. When he finds out that Paul is from Cilicia, he immediately agrees to the hearing. And as you end the 24th chapter, you recognize that Felix has a motive regarding Paul that he hopes will be successful. He leaves Paul incarcerated. He keeps Paul a prisoner, one, to show the Jews a favor. He wants to gain the favor of the Jews, and it's something that the Jews appreciate. He'll keep him incarcerated. But the real reason he kept him incarcerated and actually communicated with Paul on numerous occasions was because he hoped Paul would offer a bribe. He was hoping that Paul would offer him money to be set free. And the fact that he learned he was from Cilicia indicated that he came from a place where there was affluence. There was a great amount of wealth in that area. And so it may be, in inquiring about the province, it wasn't so much just about jurisdiction. Do I need to hear this man? Is he really a Roman? It may have been, oh, he's from Cilicia. I'm going to listen to him because it could be materially advantageous to me. That's the kind of man Felix happened to be. Well, in chapter 24, we have the prosecution's charges. And we're not going to necessarily go through and look at this word by word and verse by verse, but understand that the prosecution here, as Paul stands before Felix, 5 days has passed since Paul arrived, and now this delegation from Jerusalem is going to arrive. Now you have Ananias the high priest, and you have with him some elders, some certain of the leaders of the Jews, a certain delegation from the Sanhedrin council. Now notice we don't have the 40 men that were part of the reason he was there to begin with, that the letter had spoken about. You know, he had been told, Felix had been told about these 40 men, how they were going to kill him. He was also about how they laid in wait for him in verse number 30 of chapter 23. But none of those men are said to have been there. The Jews from Asia are not said to be present. They're the ones who actually began all of this hubbub. They're the ones who saw Paul in the temple and accused him of profaning the temple, of desecrating the temple. But they're not there. We have the high priest and we have certain members of the Sanhedrin, and they bring with them an orator named Tertullus. The term orator actually comes from a word, a Greek word, rhetor, R-H-E-T-O-R, if you transliterate it. In Latin, the same word means a teacher of rhetoric, but in the Greek terminology, using the Greek word that Luke writes here, it actually means one who is a forensic orator or an advocate. Basically what we would think about a lawyer. Here is one who is skilled in the form of Roman law. He understands how these hearings work. He understands how to present the material of the hearing. And so these Jews, they hire this orator, Tertullus, this advocate, this lawyer who is acquainted with Roman form and law, and he is going to represent them with these accusations or these charges against Paul. Now, keep in mind that this is not the same as Jesus. I think just a quick point of knowledge that we need to have here. The word orator comes from that Greek rhetor, or the idea of a forensic orator or advocate, a lawyer. But in 1 John chapter 2, we have the Greek term parakletos, meaning advocate, used regarding Jesus. Jesus is our advocate. Jesus is our attorney, if you will, but not in the same sense that Tertullus was. Tertullus was a hired man. He was a mercenary. He had no concern regarding Paul. It was about what he gained by representing this Jewish faction. Jesus, on the other hand, being described as a parakletos, he is not only an advocate, he is an intercessor and comforter. He is an individual who has a concern for us. He can plead our case because he understands our case. He is concerned about our case. He wants us to be well represented, not because of what he gets out of it, but because of what we get out of it. And that's the kind of advocate we have in Jesus. Quite a difference between Jesus and Tertullus, but every one of us need that advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, because he understands, he knows, he can present our case to the Father in a very sympathetic way as he intercedes for us. Tertullus is just a paid mercenary lawyer, and he is going to say whatever he needs to say in order to win for his clients, whether it's true or not. And so Tertullus begins with flattery. He wants to gain favor. It is true that Felix had put down several attempted riots. History bears that out. The historians will tell you that happened. But Tertullus, in utilizing that, is going to lead into Paul was causing one of these riots. And so we want you to handle him the way you've handled these others. That's the use of the flattery here. We could mention some things about flattery, but we won't here. Just understand, flattery has a purpose of deception. And we should never be individuals that use flattering words to achieve our purposes. We should speak the truth in love, but in all things we should speak the truth. And so the idea of flattering words as Tertullus uses them, we could go back to passages like Psalm 12, 2 and 3, Job 32, 21 and 22, Job 17, 5, Psalms 5, 9, Proverbs 20 and verse 19 says, "He that goeth about as a talebearer revealeth secrets. Therefore meddle not with him that flattereth with his lips." Or in Proverbs 29, 5, "A man that flattereth his neighbor spreadeth a net for his feet." Paul had assured the Thessalonian brethren in 2 Thessalonians 2 that he had not used flattering words. He had just spoken the gospel truth to them, the word of God, and they received it as it was in truth, the word of God, not the word of men. And so we need to avoid the use of flattery. It's not something that the Christian should employ in the use of his tongue. But Tertullus tried to do it in order to sway the favor of Felix to the side of the Jews who were trying to kill the Apostle Paul. Now, the charges are three. Number one, and if you read it, you might say, well, there's four. But notice here he says in verse number 5, "We have found this man," talking about Paul, "a pestilent fellow and a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world." That is one charge, really. Calling him a pestilent fellow means that he is a man who undermines, he is a man who corrupts the morals, the good behavior of others. And he himself, just his presence, just his existence, puts people in an uproar. No matter where he's at, no matter who he's around, he's going to corrupt them. He is a pestilence. And in so being that kind of person, he is a mover or an exciter of sedition. Now, that's a charge that would gain the notice of the Roman government. It was an illegal thing to be a seditionist. It was an illegal thing to cause disturbance in the empire. And so if Paul was found guilty of that, he is a man that could be put to death by the Roman officials for having caused insurrection. So that's one charge. This first charge goes to the Roman law. The second charge also is an appeal to the Roman law, as he talks about his relationship to the Jewish world. In verse number 5, he says, "A ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Of course, the ringleader is the point man. He is the leader of this activity. And by calling it the sect of the Nazarenes, the idea is it's a schismatic sect. It's one that's causing destruction or division. And the fact that he uses the term sect here is a word that means heresy. And so they're saying what he is doing is a heresy. It's not even the same thing as Judaism. It's something false. So basically they're accusing Paul here before Felix of introducing new religion. He's using the Jewish religion to try to do it, but it's not the Jewish religion. It's a heresy. It's something different. It's something new. And of course, the Roman law was such that you could not introduce. If it was already in existence when Rome took over, when Rome exerted power throughout the world, they could go ahead and practice it, so long as it didn't cause disturbance within the empire. But if it was something new, that was illegal. And so what Tertullus is saying about Paul and what Paul is teaching is that it is something new. It is a heresy. It's not the same thing that the Jews teach. And then the third charge, as it relates to the Jewish law, is that he profaned the temple. In verse number 6, who hath also gone about to profane the temple. Now, this charge relates to his interaction with the Jews. This is not something that the Roman officials would have necessarily been concerned with. But what it's introduced to say is, look, Paul violated us. He broke our law. He profaned our temple, and we were going to handle him. We were going to deal with him. But Lysias got in the way. This wouldn't have even come to you. Remember in verse number 4 how he said, we won't be further tedious unto you. We're not going to hinder you. Take up your time. Now think about those introductory words of flattery. You have kept the peace by putting down several riots. And we hate that we're even bothering you with this. Now see, we could have taken care of this ourselves. This didn't even have to be your problem, Felix. But Lysias intervened. He stopped us, and he came against us violently and kept us from handling this ourselves, and now it's a bother to you. So everything Tertullus is saying is about winning the favor of Felix. But nothing he said is actually true. And next week, when we look at Paul's answer here, we will understand that, that these accusations cannot be substantiated. And Paul actually answers them with his defense in verse 10 through 23 and says, I didn't do any of that. So we have Paul's defense. And just as we end it, think of, a couple of things we've talked about. The Bible is inspired of God. And there is evidence from its accuracy regarding history and geography and other things. We know the Bible is God's communication, and the accuracy of history and the accuracy of geography and so forth undergird that understanding. We understand that it matters what we say. We must let our yea be yea and our nay, nay. We see an example where great problem, great harm has been brought to the Apostle Paul because some men vowed foolishly to assassinate him, to kill him. And so we give some consideration to that. And we also see that even with Lysias, we need to be completely truthful with our words. Don't shade the truth. Don't color it. Don't spin it so it makes you look better. Say it for what it is. Present the truth, whether it's going to benefit you or not. Always speak the truth. Now, speak the truth in love, but always be a supporter and a teacher and a practitioner of truth. And then, of course, don't flatter. Don't be using your tongue for flattery. Be truthful. Present the truth in a loving fashion, but let flattering words belong to those who interject foolishness. Don't be one who does that yourself. And next week, we'll come back and we'll look at how Paul answered this. And one of the things we'll notice is that Paul was unashamed. Paul was not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and we'll explain what we mean by that. Let us not be ashamed either, though, as we go forward. Well, that's a little more about Acts chapter 23 and Acts chapter 24. Not quite the application heavy that we've had in some of the other lessons, but nonetheless, our time is out. So there's more to say. There's more to look at with Paul and Felix, but we'll get to that next week. God bless you. Until then.